Welcome to Keen on Keys. Here is another beauty from the early 80s, the Casio MT-65. It's in my top 5 of the best looking Casio keyboards of all times, together with the MT-45, 60, 70 and 400V. But besides the look, it's also quite versatile. It has 49 keys, 8-note polyphony, 4 when the accompaniment is running, 20 presets or tones as Casio calls them, sustain, reverb, vibrato and modulation effects, 4 bass tones, 2 chord modes, 12 styles with variations for bass, chord and arpeggio, synchro start, fill-in and separate volume controls for the accompaniment and drums. And of course a speaker. On the back we have a pitch control, headphone jack and a single RCA line out, cause this keyboard is all mono. It can run on 5 D-size batteries or with a 7.5 volts power supply, negative center. If you leave it alone, it turns itself off after 6 minutes. The MT-65 was released in early 1983. It's the successor or the advanced version of the MT-45, as they were released almost at the same time. And it's also one of the most sought after MT models. The original price was £175 or $300, so it was a bit more expensive than the MT-45. One might think that the MT-60, which looks exactly like the 45, was released in between these two models. But the numbering is always a bit confusing. The MT-60 came out a bit earlier than the MT-45, and it looks the same, but it sounds different. I will make a video about it later. The MT-65 was re-released in a different color as the MT-68 in 1984. And like a lot of MT models, it also has a bigger brother, the CT-405. With additional volume and sustain pedal jacks, memory, octave down and transpose switches, and an integrated power supply. It just needs a little bit cleaning, but I will have a look inside anyway. This is the accompaniment chip you already know from the MT-45, the NEC D930G. But the MT-65, 68 and CT-405 are the first and only models that allow access to all of the accompaniment features the D930 offers. Manual bass, 12 styles and 4 variations for bass, chords and arpeggio. It's 6-note polyphonic, 1 for bass, 1 for arpeggio and 4 for chords. It also produces the trigger pulses for the analog drums. But there's still a lot to do if you're into circuit bending, as you can see with these beautifully modified models from ASCAT. Here we have the second chip, the D931. It's for the main voice. It has 8-note polyphony and is controlled by the D930 accompaniment chip. And this combination of chips was used for quite a lot of Casio keyboards between 1983 and 1986. Of course the MT-68 and CT-405, but also the MT-100, MT-400V and CT-410V, MT-85 and 86, MT-52 and CT-320, MT-210 and CT-430, MT-800 and CT-810, MT-500, CT-310, 605 and 606, 610 and 620, 7000 and the CK500. But that doesn't mean that all these models sound exactly the same. still a bit grease left. It's necessary for a smooth key action, but this will be gone after I've cleaned all parts with water and mild soap. Here we see the variable resistors for the drum sounds. I guess they changed the decay. The volume knobs are a bit scratchy. I will try contact spray. I'm still not quite sure about the best way to clean the coated key and button contacts. I use isopropyl alcohol, but only very slightly. I don't want to wipe off too much of the coating. Before I put the keys back in, I add some grease again. It should be quite thick, to make sure it stays where it's needed. The almost 40 years old foam needs to be replaced. The speaker isn't too bad, but of course I will use one of the outputs for recording. The noise level is the same for both outputs, but the headphone jack is a little bit louder and it mutes the speaker. Let's start with the tones in normal mode. We have 20 of them. The first one is organ. Pipe organ is a lot brighter. We have some effects like sustain and reverb, which is not a real reverb effect. It's like sustain but a lot softer. We have a light vibrato and a delayed vibrato. The intensity of both can vary from tone to tone, but the main and unique feature of this keyboard is the modulation effect. Every tone has 3 variations, modulation 1, 2 and 1 and 2 together. That gives a total of 80 tones. Modulation is actually not the right term for what's happening here. This term is usually used for something like vibrato or tremolo. And as you can see in the little graphic, these buttons change the envelopes. Here we have the vowel-consonant synthesis again. Each tone consists of 2 components. 2 digitally produced waveforms with different timbre, filter and envelope settings and maybe a different pitch are blended together to create a bit more complex sound as, let's say, the VL1 for example. These 2 buttons change both envelopes of the 2 sound components. Modulation 1 gives one waveform a fast attack and decay, and the other waveform gets a bit slower attack while decay isn't changed. The waveforms of pipe organ are an octave apart from each other. If I choose modulation 1, the higher waveform gets a fast decay and the lower waveform gets a slow attack. Modulation 2 gives both waveforms a slow attack. These little arrows show that it could also be the other way around. If you choose a tone which already has a slow attack, clarinet for example, it's the opposite. Now we have a very fast attack. Back to pipe organ. We can also use both modulation effects together. In this case, both envelopes have a slow attack. But due to modulation 1, the higher waveform has a bit faster attack and decay, and the lower waveform starts very slowly, just when the higher waveform has almost gone. But it's not necessary to know what exactly these buttons change, because the results are different for every tone. I will show you a couple of tones and variations. Oboe with modulation 1 and modulation 1 and 2. harpsichord. Sounds more like an organ with fast decay. Modulation 1, 2, and 1 and 2. The modulation effect can drastically change the volume of the overall tone, which can be a bit annoying if you try out different tones with the accompaniment. Celesta. This sounds almost like a short delay effect. Mandolin. Modulation 1 makes it slower. And modulation 2 makes it fast again. Funny, one of my favorites. Sounds a bit like a clavinet. With modulation 1 it sounds more like an organ. Modulation 2. And with both modulations you get that drop-down effect. With accordion it's the opposite. Electric piano. Vibraphone. You can turn it into a xylophone. Or into a flute. Electric guitar. With modulation 1. Cosmic is also one of my favorites, not only because of the name. It sounds like a mixture of organ and accordion. With modulation 1 it's almost a violin. Modulation 2. The presets are not all in the same tone range. So you can get some nice effects if you change them while playing. We also have 4 bass tones, which can be played in the lower section. But unlike the MT-45, we can turn the manual bass on and off. We can choose between 4 sounds with the bass variation switch. This switch is mainly to change the bass pattern. It doesn't necessarily change the bass sound. Not every style uses all 4 bass tones for the variations. It's nice to have this manual bass. So you can play 2 different sounds at the same time, but the bass is actually an octave too high. It's in the same tone range as the piano, for example. Of course, you can use the manual bass in combination with the rhythm machine. Notice that the bass has low note priority. Only the lower note will sound when 2 keys are held. And the bass sound might change if you use a fill, because every fill has its default setting for the bass tone. And by the way, the sound is re-triggered when you turn on or off the manual bass while holding down the keys. The drum machine sounds lovely. The rhythms are the same as on the MT-45, but here we have 4 additional patterns: rock, Latin swing, slow rock, bossa nova, and a separate volume control. The rhythms change immediately, so you can create fills. The sound is almost the same as on the MT-45. It's a bit warmer and has more bass, while the MT-65 sounds a bit crisper and the snare is a bit shorter. And we also have 2 additional tom sounds. Now let's have a look at the accompaniment. You will hear several times during this presentation that the chords do not always change accurately. This is only partly due to my playing skills. All early Casio keyboards have the problem that, especially the bass notes, change a little bit too late. There are 2 modes. Casio chord is the single finger mode. You can play the typical 4 chords with additional keys to the right. You can change the sound of the chords with the chord variation switch. Of course, this works for the bass as well. But these switches not only change the sound, they also change the accompaniment patterns. We can select 4 variations for bass, chords and arpeggio. So we get 64 variations for every style. And a total number of 768 combinations. Way too much to play them all. And that's not necessary. You've already heard some of them if you've watched my MT-45 video. And the variations for chords and arpeggio don't have such a great impact on the pattern as the drums or the bass line. But I have to say, I'm a huge fan of these variation sliders. Yamaha also used them for a couple of models. Unfortunately, both companies didn't continue this concept after the mid-80s. It's a pity that a lot of nice features that Casio and Yamaha also established in the early days of home keyboards were never seen again on later models. Best example is the filter on the MT-400V, but more on that in another video. Tango. Bossa Nova. 16-beat. We only have one volume control for bass, chord and arpeggio, but the arpeggio has an on and off switch. Swing. Some of the bass lines don't work with every chord progression. Sometimes it's better to play the chords in the melody section. But we also have a fingered mode, and this is much more flexible. Not only because you can play more standard chords, but also because you can play single notes. Then the bass line stays on the root note. The full bass line will sound if you press at least 2 keys. You can play every key combination you like. When the rhythm is turned off, you get a manual bass with a chord instrument on top that plays a single note. But different than in manual bass mode, the low notes are repeated in the octave above. Due to the low note priority of the bass, you can hold down a lower key and play the chord instrument without playing additional bass notes. Rock. The rock pattern is also available on the MT-45. I didn't show it in my MT-45 video because I haven't figured it out myself. Some people mentioned it in the comments. Of course I tried out the in-between settings of the selection slider. That's something I always do when a keyboard has one. But that alone doesn't do the trick. The slider has to be in a position between 16-beat and swing. A little bit closer to swing. Turn the keyboard off and on again. And here's the rock pattern. Unfortunately, the variation switch doesn't change the pattern to bossa nova, but we have at least one extra pattern. This is an almost perfect keyboard, and one of my favorite Casios. Well, I got a lot of favorites among them. The drums sound great, and the main voice is also quite nice. The tones are a bit brighter than the ones on the MT-45, maybe not as powerful as the ones on the MT-30 or 40, but the style variations and the effects section makes it very versatile. The chord changes when using the accompaniment are always a bit too late, a problem that a lot of Casio keyboards of the early 80s have. It's working, but it's sometimes a bit annoying, so I wish there was a little chord sequencer. But if you are looking for the typical sound of an early Casio keyboard, this might be the right choice. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.